Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and many speakers who have left, thank you very much. There's almost as many of you here on the podium and on the stage as in the audience. And to those of you who've managed to plough through, thank you very much for staying for this final session. So we've come to the end of what I'm sure we all agree here in this room has been an extremely informative event. And before opening up the floor to the speakers and your questions as well, I'd just like to take a few moments to summarize and contextualize the exciting energy crossroads at which Lebanon finds itself today. Now, as you've heard throughout the course of the day, depending on their size and commercial viability, Lebanon's potential energy deposits could, of course, have a huge transformative effect on this country's economy. But, of course, the choices that this country makes about how it wants to go about exploiting them and financing some of those choices, as you just heard from the last panel, will have long-lasting effects for generations to come, which is why it's so important to get these things right now, and, above all, to manage expectations as well. It's been very encouraging earlier on in the day to hear from various members of the government of Lebanon about how this country is now passing legislation that's required to get prospecting going sooner rather than later. And it's also been very encouraging to hear from members of the private sector in the form of people like Total that was present here earlier today, that despite the cost pressures that the fall in the oil price and gas price has brought over the last 5 years, exploration, it seems, is not dead in the water, not even offshore, if you get the pun. Since we're here to talk about the roadmap towards Lebanon's future oil and gas wealth, I want to pose the question, where does that lead? As you heard Dr. Ressel mentioning earlier, what is this country's vision for tapping this oil and gas when eventually it is tapped? How big are Lebanon's oil and gas deposits? Who could be the best partner to help this country develop them? And who is the ultimate customer? Could it be the domestic market? Yes. But could it also be somebody further afield as well? We heard from the former Qatari energy minister earlier on today about the opportunities of developing other sectors linked to the oil and gas sector from here for Lebanon. And last but not least, when and if that gas is tapped, what's the best distribution mechanism for it? Should Lebanon be partnering up with other neighboring countries like, for instance, Egypt and Cyprus to try and pipe that gas through if LNG terminals aren't necessarily economically viable? So those are just some of my questions. Many of you in the audience have also been asking yourselves the same things, but I want to open up the floor to your questions for our panel of esteemed guests. So the usual house rules apply. Please say who you are and lift your hand. Thanks.
Thank you. Magdi Nasrallah from Venetian University. I'm originally from the American University in Cairo, director of the Petroleum Engineering Program, and I'm here to develop a program in petroleum engineering for Venetian University. I listened to all these talks. I have a few comments and a few concerns. Coming from Egypt, I know what is really going on in the oil and gas sector. Zohr is undoubtedly a great discovery, and it really opens new venues for the entire region. And it gets us off the hook with some problems with Israel that were mentioned earlier today. Having said that, we developed Zohr in 3 years. Indeed, we have the infrastructure, but from the day of exploration to production, which will take place within the next 3 to 4 months, it's 3 years. Why do you think you have to wait 7 years to develop your reservoirs while you have all the geological studies already made? I think you can do a better job. Number two, why is it that you want non-negotiable contracts in the first place? And this is a legal issue. Being in the business for so long, I know that this is a very fast-moving industry. And it might not be to the benefit of governments to bind contracts from day one, because things can change very rapidly. Number three, which is more important, and unfortunately there is nobody from LPA here, Why is it that LPA is the body that will make the final recommendations after the bids are in? Simply to avoid suspicions, it is extremely important that you have an independent consultant to make recommendations before you move forward. And another thing which is very critical, when you look at prices of gas worldwide, the cost is around $3 per million BTU on the international market. Deep water production is about double this amount. So producing gas for simple combustion in this region is not at all the way to go. The only economic value is to process this gas. So the added value is to find means of processing into petrochemicals or liquefaction at some point. And Egypt is the only hope. It's not because I come from Egypt, but the infrastructure is already there. There must be negotiations with Egypt to stream this gas through the already available infrastructure pipelines, whether the Arab gas pipeline or the Mediterranean gas pipeline, to the shores of Egypt through Edco and Dumyata, Alexandria, and Sidi Krir to process this gas into petrochemicals. This is the real added value. Thank you.
Well, I think, Mr. Bifani, you're the member of the government here on the panel, so I'm going to hand over the microphone to you.
Thank you very much. Although it is not at all my jurisdiction, I'm taking care of the financial part. But I think that we are still at the stage where all of these options are possible. It's not yet behind us. We are just discovering the beginnings of the process. It is clear that we are now taking a few technical options. I wouldn't be able to tell you whether this is going to happen with Egypt, to take into consideration your last question. But what I know for a fact is that there are many ways that are being explored for the time being at the level of the LPA, and all of this will only become final when it goes to the Council of Ministers. So we're really at the beginning, at the first stages. Of course, your earlier comments are very welcome. I think we can do better than 7 years, but again, I'm not the specialist. But I will definitely relay all this to my colleagues at LPA. Thank you.
I'm Antoine Elkouri, Université Saint-Joseph. Regarding the appraisal well and the prospection well, none of these wells had been done to date, Mr. That's why you need not 7 years, but it may be reduced to 3 or 4 years. Because there is no exploration well. Nobody invested up to date in exploration well. That's it. Thank you.
I think there's also another element. When you're trying to compare Egypt to Lebanon, Egypt is a very seasoned country in terms of receiving FDI in its oil and gas sector. You know better than me, I'm sure. And for that matter, you have very strong institutional frameworks at the country level, whether it's the EGPC or the Ministry of Petroleum, or even, I think the political system makes it, which has elevated basically the importance of moving ahead, particularly with Al-Zohar under President Sisi, makes it a sort of, I think you're comparing apples to oranges. So I think we really need to keep in mind. But obviously, having said that, what I would like to of course, and I think you're bringing an excellent perspective into the debate, because I think that's what we should be doing. In terms of Lebanon, is actually, as some of the earlier speakers said, we should be able to learn from the experiences of seasoned countries, particularly oil-importing countries who have, in terms of their negotiations with companies, in terms of their strategies, how they build them, in terms of how they're reforming the sector, et cetera, et cetera. And certainly this is where probably I would imagine that the Lebanese institution would benefit from further exchanges. But I just have also one point in terms of your question on the commercial significance or the viability of actually going the route of trying to export. It's certainly a strategic decision that Lebanon will take, and I think as an outsider and looking at sort of the landscape for oil and gas industry, it is very clear that, as we heard again today, it's a very dynamic landscape, and the decision on what will you do with your gas will obviously depend on where we are in our own policy in terms of priorities for fiscal management, for industrialization, etc. And then looking at the broader external environment in order to weigh into the decisions to keep the gas domestically or export it or even process it. But definitely, I think the perspective of considering a value added, going higher into the value chain would be also beneficial in terms of our own objective, as Alain said earlier, of also trying to go into higher productivity jobs.
I think Mr. Malik Taqiyuddin would like to make a point.
Yes, just a quick clarification with respect to the exploration phase. And I don't represent the LPA, but I know their position, that they are keen on moving as fast as possible. That's based on the discussion with them. And they, the way that the exploration phase is divided, we have a 3-year first period for 3 years, where the contractor would have to develop a certain agreed minimum work program. And then they can move to another 3-year period for another type of, agreement of minimum work obligations. That second 3-year period is actually divided into 2 years and a final the 6th year. They cannot move to the 6th year unless they have an appraisal program. So in essence, we have a 5-year exploration period, and you can move to the 6th year with an appraisal program. Hopefully, they are hoping that we can have, at least during the first exploration phase, at least a discovery so that we can move to the appraisal. Because there's a high potential of gas, as you would know, it would take a long time it is expected it would take a long time to develop a marketing plan, an infrastructure plan. So this might, again, add up another 3 years for that to be developed, whether within the existing exploration phase or it could go beyond.
I want to ask Mr. Melki, if you have the microphone. We were talking about the legal technicalities there of all the various phases of prospecting and then eventually exploiting potential natural resources off the coast of Lebanon. But when it comes to the credibility, it's really vital to keep this project going, because last time it collapsed in 1975, didn't it? What would happen if that were to happen again?
In fact, the political risk is part of the old risk. I didn't talk about this risk because it's almost now the business in Lebanon. You have to work with this political, not uncertainty, but we have huge risks, political risk, and even military risks. It's not the main obstacle for investors. In fact, for me, the main obstacle is the governance. Because when you say, I want to issue, I don't know, a law in 6 months, you cannot go for 3 years and keep your credibility vis-a-vis of the investor, explorer, and especially in a really fast-moving, not only market. So that's why I said in 5 years ago or 4 years ago, when we started the bidding, we used to have almost 50 companies interested by this capacity of Lebanon, the potential capacity. Now, all of them not necessarily linked to the productivity of wells or exploration or exploitation. But the problem is we don't have credibility. The market is now is not very attractive for investment, but of course we should learn and benchmark with Egypt how they can go. These examples we can have also talks, and the companies that are backing such activities could be a good advisors for the Lebanese. And that's why this famous external stakeholders, it could be part of them. The professional could be part of these stakeholders.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question from the audience before I continue? You'd like to make a point? Thank you, Dr. Russell. Please.
No, just because we're here, so I want to profit also to have this guest here for some questions. So, I mean, I doubt basically that before 10 years you will have, in the positive case, gas flowing out of Lebanon for many reasons, but mainly just to be polemic. I don't see the market for it for the time being, and hopefully even, I mean, for regional stability, I mean, taking other things apart. You have Iran, which has huge reserves, which are already processed. They have the problem on it not to get it out of Iran if there are no sanctions. There's a huge potential. Russia has a huge potential. Europe wants to decline, I mean, the consumption drastically. Hence, I don't see the dash for gas here for the time being, and so I would be, let's say, cautious. And I mean, the opinion here, if people think that below 10 years or above 10 years, they think on the revenue side. And the second thing would be the question, the energy policy should, I mean, for having the poor people or whatever, what is the expectations within the next 10 years? What is be done? I mean, everybody's waiting for the gas. I had this in Cyprus too. I mean, people are, you know, and this avoids tackling problems today, basically.
In your experience with Cyprus, where does it end? Where is it likely to go?
It's a process. It's a process, but I think you are in the beginning here of a process which will lead, hopefully, to a dual approach. Let's say you do this, and in parallel you do something you can do now, hopefully. Yeah.
You're agreeing? You're agreeing?
Yes. First of all, if we want to have a clear picture regarding, you know, the prospect of the oil sector, I do believe that I will not say 10 years, but for the next 5 years, I don't think there is room for, you know, any possible, rational exploitation of that oil. However, we have one duty, is to prepare ourselves. This is in natural resources that we have. We have to do all the procedure in order to be ready, because things are moving and changing. And maybe at that time, there will be a window of opportunity for that oil. This is the only option we have to have extra revenue. We are not going to say, no, there is no possibility of marketing that oil in the coming future. This is not, acceptable in terms of, let's say, national expectation. What we have to do is to search for the optimal conditions that will allow us to profit, maybe not at the degree of, that is maximum, but for sure there will be some revenues that are essential and critical for our economy.
I hear you agreeing with that statement, Roundley.
Yes, very much so. Actually, what I would like to say here is that we are in front of a game changer here, a major one. And what is 10 years when we're talking about such a big change? This is a country that has always lived without resources, that has always been boosted by human capital, and that basically is undergoing major changes. And the fact of having potentially assets, resources to be managed properly is something of great importance. And this is typically what we need to do properly. It doesn't mean at all that this game changer is going to necessarily be a good one. It means that we have to avoid whatever happens, the temptation of doing things the easy way. The temptations of...
What constitutes the easy way for you?
The easy way is to continue to spend as if we didn't have to make sure that we are properly managing our public finance. The easy way is to believe that oil and gas is the solution to all the problems that the government is not confronting in the proper way. That is the easy way, and this is exactly what we shouldn't do. Petroleum is an additional item that needs to be always kept separate from the rest of the economy. We need to look at the non-oil budget. We need to look at the economy per se, its capacity, its productivity, its competitiveness. And once we are sure that we are still doing things properly, then this asset, of course, becomes a fantastic thing.
Let's see, there's another question from the audience. Thank you.
Hello. I hope you had a good day. I have a general question about what do you have advice about the students who are studying petroleum engineering that will be in the industry in a few years, and what to expect, how to manage their expectations, and if you have any advice on what would you like them to specialize in, because during the whole day you were mostly talking about gas. So my question to you, how should they manage their expectations, and what should they specialize in?
Should we give that one to Jean-Paul Sabat, by any chance? Somebody from academia.
Hi. If just I understand the question, you are asking about the specialization of the student, how which specializations you should have. Yes. Yeah.
I think he meant what advice should you be giving Lebanese future oil and gas workers, people who are training at universities?
Yes, so actually I will begin first of all to join Dr. Nasser with his thoughts. So I agree we have to prepare ourselves. So having said this, so I think as for the competence, we have to prepare ourselves for the student or for the employee or for companies to prepare ourselves with legal competence, with engineer, with trade finance, with project finance, with everything related to RBL. So today we have the oil and gas field. So I guess as we cannot predict if it will be 5, 6, or 7 years, I guess based on this we were talking with Mr. Stéphane Attali. So we have to go in parallel. With the competence. So, and we need all the competence. We need the legal, we need the engineer, we need the marketing, we need the trading, and we need the exploration production. So we have to relate the downstream and the upstream. I don't know if it's clear or...
If you're a student currently, if I understand correctly, I think there's a number of things that you can do. One, there are already free materials on oil and gas that you can find online. Very important. If you like, I can send you a few links. So this is important that you can develop your knowledge. Two, if you're really interested in the industry, apply to work outside of Lebanon for now. Go and develop your skills and come back in a few years. One thing to assure, I don't know if it was mentioned in the session, that 80% of the workforce should be Lebanese. Obviously, we don't have that at the moment, but if you have developed your expertise at least for 2 years in the Gulf or somewhere else, you will have an excellent advantage when you come back.
Aren't they? You were asking for specific, detailed advice, and I think you got it there. I just want to ask Matt Drinkwater what you also think, because from an international perspective...
It's an interesting question in terms of the next generation of people who work in the energy sector. I mean, one of the things that I've been quite struck by over the 10 years or so I've been reporting on the energy industry in Europe is how it's shifted away from what was a very monolithic, vertically integrated industry into an incredibly dynamic, data-driven industry with lots of very bright people trying to come up with innovative solutions to the essential problem of how you keep the lights on and your house at a certain temperature. So the people who I'm now coming across in the industry are people who are looking at things like how we integrate big data and things like blockchain into the data side of the industry, so that it can respond more quickly to changes in supply and demand, and we can plan our infrastructure investments much more cleverly, so that we don't have to overbuild the generation and production capacity to the extent that we've had to in the past to cover the demand peaks. So I think there's a lot of potential to learn really kind of cross-cutting skills by looking at it as, you know, how does this fit into a larger energy system, and how do we manage that energy system?
Let's see if we have a question from Monsieur Assad.
Just I want to give one point of view. I think the mere fact that the decrees have been ratified is already a very, very big start. Now, whether it takes 6 years, 7 years, or 10 years, for me, I think it doesn't matter. Because from now, it's going to create a certain momentum and a stimulus, okay? And probably more jobs, not enough. Even if the real wealth will come in 10 years' time, doesn't matter. But the economy will start a little bit moving and going better, which will help what we are talking about the universities and so on. We at Front Page, we have done several conferences in several universities in Lebanon, okay? From USG to Haigazian, to Sagesse, to Lebanese, and so on. And we know that they are now giving courses on this, and even they have graduated some MBAs. So the mere fact that this will start, and all this new generation, okay, whether they are outside or inside, they see and they feel, okay, they are tempted to come and join the club. And this is what we need, which we are calling, at the end of the day, the lobbying within our own country. And we have to encourage this.
And part of that is human capital, isn't it? Future potential human capital as well, who can work in this sector. But I want to come to real capital. Joel Aswad, when it comes to the sort of timeframes of what we're talking about here, whether it's 3 years for Egypt, several years perhaps for Lebanon, more than 10 years, as Dr. Ressel was saying before, the financial sector providing the capital for that, how much patience does the financial sector have? How much guidance will it need from Lebanon?
Normally, well, the thing is the financing comes at the end. So it's the result of everything. So the financing is something that is required. If I'm going to state maybe a bit bluntly, we're not going to spend time studying the feasibility and the financing we could put before we see really something. Because even if the exploration comes up with a real potential, the decision will not be in the hand of even if you have the financing, this is not why you're going to start the exploration. You need the overall system around. But clearly, all what Lebanon could provide in terms of fiscal consideration, everything related, like Mr. Bifani was saying, if something around the sovereign wealth fund is structured, everything contributes to reducing the country risk and the perception of Lebanon, as like Alia was saying a little bit in the low part of the countries running efficiently their energy. There are a lot of things that could be done in Lebanon, starting with the electricity, starting with it's a country where we have a lot of solar energy. Renewables could be also part of the equation. It's not everything related to oil and gas. And this is also part of the things that could help create in Lebanon opportunities for financing for large institutions. Until we have the results of oil.
I got your point. Let's see if there's any more questions from the audience. And I'm just going to put a couple of final questions to our panel. We have one there.
For Mrs. Aswad, concerning the project finance and SPV, it's really based on, it's a business based on risk mitigation and so risk taxonomy. But what are the chances to witness project finance in Lebanon with the insurance sector being as it is today? Or would it rely on international companies? What do you think about it?
for the time being, the project finance is more linked to midstream project. So if we're talking about, again, the oil and gas industry, it's something that could come, if we're talking about 10 years to get through the exploration and production phase, so midstream comes just after that. For the time being, with what we know about Lebanon, if we go to project finance involving international institutions, it has to be ring fence from a country risk perspective. So institution in Lebanon could be part of it, but it's not something that is going to be structured solely in Lebanon if you want to bring international expertise. For the time being, again.
Can I just ask a quick question to Ali Mubayed? When it comes to the idea of potentially using gas in Lebanon, even if it's imported, to ready the economy and to ready industry for potential gas that's domestic, is now the time to start doing that? Is that a viable economic strategy, do you think, for the country?
Well, I think it's very obvious to any observer of the Lebanese economy, and it's huge, both external and fiscal imbalances, that our energy import bill and is a huge problem, and this energy import bill basically is high because basically we are relying on the the costlier option basically, and trying to exchange the current fuel-based system with more environment-friendly gas, and as we heard, benefit from the opportunity that actually the supply glut in the natural gas market could benefit us in terms of lower prices, is exactly should be a strategic priority for the country that is facing significant pressure on its own reserves, and that is running a double-digit fiscal and external and current account deficit. So going towards looking at the viability of importing gas is only one element of these adjustments that we should be doing. And this is why I argued in my presentation that we should anchor our energy policy in a broader macro-fiscal framework. Maybe Dr. Russell said, yes, of course, even a bigger vision. But this vision has to look at where do we need to adjust in order to lower our imbalances, render our country risk much lower so that we are able to attract capital at lower cost and be able exactly to make our banks lend to the private sector at also a much lower cost. And reducing the import bill is only one of those elements that could be conducive towards that path.
No, sorry, because this was of course, one of the questions which was very important in Cyprus as well, because they wanted also, and they want still to import, let's say, some gas somehow for the Cypriot economy, and in the second stage use their own one once they find is sufficient and so on. And then that immediately brings the question to what you need the gas for. I mean, one is only substitute the petrol, I mean, but where in electricity generation, or do you want to go down the transport lane? Do you want to, substitute petrol against natural gas fired, or electricity, more electricity and electricity vehicles, or e-mobility, and so on, which brings you down to basically revamping your whole energy vision, strategy, whatever, and so on. And I really think it's only paper, and it's you have huge human capital here, and so on. I mean, it's just thinking larger and to come up then with the right figure, meaning you need 1 BCM or you need 5 BCM per year, or you don't need a gas at all, whatever. I mean, like Norway, for example.
Yeah, for sure.
By the way, Norway is now the best example, in my opinion, of a very successful sovereign fund. They have accumulated till now maybe 800 billion of euro, and they passed a law now to use the proceeds for only 4%, which means that basically they are injecting in the budget maybe $30 billion a year. But of course, this accumulation of 800 million are taken maybe 15 or 20 years. I hope we can reach this stage.
Well, let's ask Monsieur Attali, is Norway an option for you? Oh, I'll come back to you, Mr. Sabah.
I just want to come back about something was said. First of all, I want to thank Mustafa about his remark because it was very pertinent. And I want to come back about what was said by Dr. Nasser, Alain, and Stefan, just to wake up a little bit the panel. I don't think that it will be above 10 years for me. I think it will be less than 5 to 6 years for several reasons. First of all, we have three types of reserve. We have proven, probable, and possible. And as Mustafa said, it's a moving environment, and it depends on several parameters. First of all, about the geopolitics. We don't control the geopolitics. Second, about investment. And third, about the break-even, the price of the oil and gas. So today, we cannot say it will be 5, 6, 7 years. I agree, but I don't think it will be 10 years. It will be less for me than 10 years. And it depends about technology. We should not forget.
If you were a betting man, what would be your bet on that? 5 years?
I could say yes. Let's say take the mean. It's 5 years.
All right.
It should be positive.
We won't ask you where the oil price is heading then. That would be an interesting answer. So I think we're almost done with our panel. I'll just because I did ask you a question, so I want to give you a chance to finish, Mr. Attali. We were talking there about Norway being a potential option. Would that work for Lebanon as a sovereign wealth option for oil?
Yes, of course. There's no reason why it wouldn't work. Actually, we have been very much in contact with the Norwegian. We received significant technical assistance from them. And the reason why it works is that the two countries, although we don't realize that, look a bit like each other in terms of size, in terms of the concentration of the growth engines that they had before the oil, and the lack of resources that was there in both cases. The reason why it should work is that precisely we are in the same situation. We need a fund for stabilization, and we need a fund to boost our efforts to bring the country back to the standards where it should have. And I think that precisely what we need to do now is to try to, if you want, preserve what we're doing on the oil sector and not jump immediately to starting to use the reserves before even finding them. And that, of course, is typically what we need to achieve.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. And before we go, I would like to read out the recommendations from the forum. So these are the recommendations that the forum has after today's events. Microphone? Okay. Well, I'll have to get rid of another recommendation. 5 recommendations from the forum today, namely that Lebanon should, 1, stay committed to the licensing schedule for exploiting its hydrocarbon reserves now that that schedule is well and truly underway. This would be, as we've established before in this panel, to avoid a loss of credibility with international oil companies. Second of all, the forum also recommends that Lebanon should, even before those reserves have been extracted, consider the fact that, as we mentioned just before, cheap gas does offer this country a chance to prepare its economy for using its own gas in years to come. And that could be achieved by shifting this country's supply towards gas now, even if that gas does have to be imported for the short to medium term. Number 3, another recommendation is that Lebanon should forge good relationships with some of its international investors and private companies to build the infrastructure that's needed for developing this country's oil and gas fields. And investment should be made also in education to train up a future generation of Lebanese oil and gas workers. And Lebanon should also foster closer regional cooperation with hydrocarbon-rich countries like, for instance, Egypt and Cyprus, as we've mentioned on this panel today, to develop an economically viable distribution network for its energy. And finally, number 5, this work should be undertaken, as we've also established in this panel, in a transparent manner, adhering to international standards of corporate governance, and the wealth that is created should be managed in a way as to create inclusive growth that everybody could benefit from, to be truly transformative for Lebanon. Last but not least, of course, managing expectations in terms of the time frame and the size of these projects and their viability will be key. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Before we leave, I'd like just to say a few words. I know it has been a very long day, and thanks for everybody having been there. Let me just say to the speakers and the audience that all today's conferences have been videotaped, and some of them have been live on televisions. We will make sure that we will send you all the material to each one of you. We appreciate and are actually proud to have invited such distinguished speakers today. And on behalf of our chairman, Karim Nassa, stand up. And from Page team, we really thank you from the bottom of our heart. And before you leave, would like to have a photo with all of you and the Front Page team, please. Thank you.